Open the pod bay doors, Howell.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
What would you do with a brain if you had one?
Do? Why, if I had a brain, I could...
Miles per hour.
I could while away.
46.56 degrees.
So thank you guys for coming out on a Tuesday night to watch Contact, and thank you, Zach, for organizing this, as always. So I really, really love movies. I'm a frequent moviegoer. I see almost every movie that comes out that has reasonably good reviews. I did see Passengers last weekend as well. So I'm always happy to come out here and talk to you guys, and I believe, film is an important conduit to communicate science. So my memories of Contact, I was really excited to do this because it's one of my absolute favorite films. It came out when I was 13, and I remember seeing a preview for it and begging my mom to take me. And of course, we lived in the middle of nowhere, so there were no theaters playing it. So she drove me 2 hours to see Contact, and immediately after the film, took me to a bookstore, and I got the book, and I became a 13-year-old Sagan zealot, which may or may not be a frightening concept. But when I think back on this, I remember really being floored by the first scene of this movie, and I'm so excited to see that in a theater again. I think it was the first time that I thought about how an extraterrestrial civilization might look at our civilization, because we're constantly leaking these radio and TV signals, and eventually Mad Men will get to Alpha Centauri, but Keeping Up with the Kardashians is going to get there as well someday. So I'm not sure quite what they'll make of that. But I also love that this is humanist sci-fi, and if any of you have seen Arrival recently, that's a film that reminded me a lot of this, right? It's an example. We see extraterrestrials portrayed a lot as kind of these nefarious, militaristic civilizations who come to annihilate us. And Contact and Arrival and Close Encounters are about how aliens reach out to us to help us learn about ourselves. In some ways, make us a better civilization. So I'm excited to revisit that. And work together, right? There's an international collaboration component to this film and Arrival as well. And I think I saw this movie and read this book at kind of an important time for me. I was in middle school, kind of thinking about science as a career and engineering as a career. Apollo 13 really made me want to be an engineer. This movie made me want to be a scientist. And I was a physics major in undergrad. It was probably in large part because of this film and book, although I decided not to pursue that in grad school. But in middle school, I remember it told me, it's okay to ask the big questions, and science encourages us to ask the big questions, and so that's what I remember from this. It's okay to ask, is there a creator? What does science have to say about that? Or are we alone in the universe? So thank you for coming out. I'm really excited to be here, and I'm excited to talk to Steve after, since he's an astrobiologist and knows a lot more about the things in this film than I do, but I'm very passionate about it. Thanks.
Thank you. Big hand for Tracy. We'll talk to her afterwards. And I mean, okay, so afterwards, we're talking to an astrobiologist. We're speaking with Tracy, who's clearly passionate and so knowledgeable about this stuff. But what we will be talking about after the movie is the search for extraterrestrial life. So you're not going to want to miss it. Stick around and enjoy the film. We'll see you afterwards. All right. Thank you all so much for sticking around. Did you guys enjoy the movie? Yeah. It's been a while since I've seen it. Anyway, all right, I'll stop talking. We'll get to the meat and potatoes of this. I want to invite Tracy Prater back up, and she'll introduce our speaker for this evening. So once again, let's give Tracy a big round of applause for being here. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thanks. Okay, so thanks for sticking around. That was a fantastic film. So excited to see that again on the big screen. So I'm going to introduce Dr. Steve Howell, who we're very lucky to have join us tonight. He is the head of the Space Sciences and Astrobiology Division at NASA Ames, which is out in Mountain View, California. He was the project scientist previously for both the Kepler and the K2 missions. He received his PhD in astrophysics at the University of Amsterdam, has over 900, scientific publications. His textbook on charge-coupled devices, which are digital imaging detectors for telescopes, is a pretty popular book. And he also thinks Pluto is a planet, so we're already friends.
Thanks, Tracy.
It's good to meet you.
Yeah, good to meet you too. Hi.
Hi.
And hello, Belcourt. Thank you.
All right, so we'll get the
You guys are
conversation.
one of my favorite cities in the world. Nashville rock, man.
So we'll get the conversation started. I said in my introductory remarks that I really like this movie and the story because it's not afraid to ask the big questions. I think one of the key messages in it is that science actually encourages us to ask those big questions. So let's start with that discussion of the process of how we figure things out, and particularly how you, as an astronomer, search for extraterrestrial life. Right? So the film portrays one technique in the arsenal you have available to you, and that's radio astronomy. But you worked for a number of years on NASA's Kepler mission, which is a space telescope launched in 2009 that looks at the intensity of stars and dips in that intensity that happen when a planet traverses that star, and what that tells you about the size of the planet and its distance from the star, and whether it might be potentially in what's called the Goldilocks or habitable zone. So talk about the technique in the film versus Kepler. Thanks.
Sure, thanks, Tracy. So one way we can search for life in the universe is this way. I'll put my head on here. And if you guys can see this, let me back up a little bit here. You see my cool hat? See, one way is we can do that, and we can look in crystal balls, but that doesn't work very well. So we decided probably in 1999 that we were going to try to launch a space mission that was going to find planets the size of the Earth that orbited stars similar to our sun. And it took many, many years to convince people that we could do it. And that's the first step in looking for life elsewhere. You first have to find, are there other planets that are small like the Earth? Rocky surfaces, places that might have liquid water, places that are in the Goldilocks zone or the habitable zone that have the right temperature so water isn't frozen and water isn't evaporated. And that's the first step. So far, Kepler has found about 4,000 planets that orbit other stars. Of those, about 500 of them are the size of the Earth that orbit roughly in the habitable zone, the place where you might imagine conditions like the Earth exist. And if you extrapolate that number to the Milky Way galaxy, so the galaxy we live in, it extrapolates to the fact that there are 20 million planets like the Earth in our galaxy. So while we don't know if there's life on any of these yet, that's a pretty big number. And so that makes me pretty confident that we're not alone.
So I'm going to follow up on that with a little bit of a question about the Fermi paradox, which is talked about a little bit at the beginning of the film. So the Fermi paradox says, you look at the Drake equation, you look at the rates that stars are forming, you look at the billions and billions of stars. Statistically, it's pretty likely that there's life. But Enrique Fermi said, if there is, well, where is it? We haven't seen it yet. So comment on that a little bit within the context of the film and your own experience as an astronomer.
Yeah. Absolutely, Tracy. That's a great thing. We all think about the Fermi paradox, a thing that was sort of laid out as an equation in sense, but looked at, how many planets there are, what's the length of civilizations on the planets, and there was big concern that we would all kill each other by nuclear wars, and therefore planets couldn't last very long with human life on it or intelligent life. But one of the things the Fermi paradox doesn't take into account is that space is really big. Things are really far apart. And so if I was on a planet like the Earth with an intelligent civilization, would I spend a lot of time and effort and money on trying to communicate with another planet that's very far away? So how much of my economy would I put into building a giant radio telescope or a giant laser beam or something like that to communicate with another planet that might be hundreds to thousands of light years away? And that factor is not in the Fermi equation. And I think if you put that into the Fermi equation, then it means that the paradox is solved. The paradox is that space is big and we're really far apart.
So shifting gears a little bit, one aspect of this story that I find really interesting is the idea that there's this wealthy person who, when all funding has run out, comes in this deus ex machina way and saves the day. And historically, that has happened a little bit. SETI had its own set of funding woes since its inception, since it was part of NASA. It was canceled in 1981. Sagan went and lobbied for it. They still had funding, and then Congress officially canceled it in 1994. But we've had some, very wealthy people step up to continue this, including Jodie Foster a few years ago as well.
Yeah,
kind of in an interesting, come full circle kind of way. And I guess last year we had the announcement of Yuri Milner, who's this Russian tycoon, very similar to the figure we see in the film, announcing his breakthrough initiatives. So one of them is the Breakthrough Listening, which is funding a lot of radio astronomy work, and then Breakthrough Starshot, which is the centimeter small spacecraft flying out to Alpha Centauri, powered by a light sail and lots of ground-based lasers.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's been a long history. Oh, here, I'll put my rich hat on. Yeah, so there's been a long history of rich people funding astronomy. It's a field that gathers attention, that people are thrilled by. They love the universe. They love space. So as far back in the United States as the early 1900s, rich people have funded the Mount Wilson telescope, for example, that's outside of Los Angeles. It's a 100-inch mirror. At the time, it was the largest telescope in the world. After that, they funded the 200-inch telescope. They funded the Keck telescopes in Hawaii. They funded, as you mentioned, the Allen Array, and all this money from Milner to fund more searching for life in the universe. So rich people have really done a great job for astronomers outside what you and I know, Tracy, as the government, to fund people to do, the next big steps. And even if you look at things like SpaceX, I mean, SpaceX is a private corporation that has very big dreams of going to Mars, of having rockets that do all kinds of things. And it's an initiative that I think is interesting in terms of how it fits in with the space program, how it fits in with our looking for other planets. Now, NASA, on the other hand, is doing its own job of looking for planets. As you know very well, Tracy, we're launching the James Webb Space Telescope in about a year. And after that, there's a telescope called WFIRST. And these telescopes have many, many things they're going to do. They're not just going to care about planets and life in the universe, but they're going to do many things like try to measure the atmosphere of a planet similar to the Earth that orbits another star. Or they're going to take an image of a planet that orbits another star. And these are our first real steps to finding something that could be a second Earth, something that's like us, that has life.
Yeah, so just a note on James Webb for the audience. You guys should definitely look at that. That's launching in 2018. And so Hubble Space Telescope looked at the visible light side of the electromagnetic spectrum. James Webb is going to look at the infrared. It's going to Lagrange point. It's going farther out than it could be serviced by humans. And if anyone says that NASA doesn't do risky missions, they should look up James Webb, I think.
Yeah, it's scary.
It has a very high risk posture. So there's an Arthur C. Clarke quote that says, I don't know if there's extraterrestrial life or not, but either possibility is overwhelming. I think the film delves into that very well in showing us how various communities, whether it's the political community or the military community or the religious community and the scientific community, would react to a discovery such as that. Do you think what is portrayed in the film is realistic in terms of how the far-reaching implications of this to those various communities?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. In the film, you're exactly right. I mean, it brings in religion, it brings in government, it brings in the military and all that. And there's been, if the folks in the audience are fans of kind of science fiction films in general, and 1950s films in particular, when we had the Cold War, and the films were about aliens, or were they about Russians? I mean, it was kind of, you didn't really know what the film was about. But we've seen this in many, many films and how you would handle it. And I have a little bit of personal experience in Tucson, Arizona for many years. And one of the telescopes up on the observatory there, called Kitt Peak National Observatory, was an observatory that was looking for near-Earth asteroids that might come and hit the Earth. And so every night they scanned the skies and they looked for asteroids, and occasionally they found asteroids that might have very close passages to the Earth. They might have orbits near the Earth. And I asked them one night, I said, so what would happen if you found something that was going to hit the Earth? What would you do? You know, it's kind of like if you discovered a signal, what would you do? Would you tell anybody or would you not? I said, so let's say you found something and in 3 days it's going to destroy the Earth. What do you do? And their answer was, well, we have a protocol. And I said, oh, great. What's your protocol? Well, our protocol is that if it's going to hit the Earth within 2 days, we just shut up. So that didn't seem very good to me. You know? And so I thought, wow, that's not very good, right? And they said, because there's nothing you can do in 2 days, and if you said anything, all you would cause is panic. So I think they've changed that since then, and that, in fact, that project is long gone. But you know, I think it comes out in the film, right? If you find something as a scientist, you're very excited. You want to tell the world about it. But telling the world has a lot of implications, and they brought some of these to life in the film.
Yeah, and I think Congress at the end just has such a vested interest in not dealing with the fallout from this.
That's
so
right.
They're just very anxious to dust that under the rug.
Absolutely.
So I don't want to dominate and have an opportunity to have some audience Q&A, so we'll do that at this point.
Maybe someone will ask about the role of women in science fiction films.
Yeah, I had that on my list. So if somebody wants to play
Yeah,
that.
so raise your hand. I'll bring the mic out to you, and you can ask our guy a question. Oh, all right, right here.
Would you go into space given the opportunity?
Is that for me or Tracy?
I want you both to answer it.
The answer for me is yes. Who wouldn't go into space? Come on, it'd be so cool.
So I would. I actually applied to be an astronaut with the last round, but did not make the cut. I would on the contingency that I could maybe take my dog, maybe take my boyfriend, be able to take a shower. That's something you can't actually do on space station. There's a lot of dry shampoo. So a little bit of glamping in space for me, I think.
Glamping in space. Yeah, now Tracy, would you go to Mars or would you just like go to Earth orbit?
Just low Earth orbit.
Yeah,
I would be a Bigelow space hotel tourist.
How many people in the audience would go to Mars if it's 2 years of your life? Let's see the hands. Come on. All right,
But
great.
you get to
There's
come
a
back?
sign-up seat probably in the lobby because we're looking for people that want to go to Mars.
All right, some more questions. Yeah, coming to you.
Hi. So, as we see in the movie, and as you mentioned, women in sci-fi are pretty rare, and there's been a pickup lately, like in Arrival in this film. And so I think one theme that we see in a lot of these films is these dichotomies between the secular and the religious, or the scientific and the military, or women and men, and between humanity and aliens. And so how, as humans, how are you guys with NASA approaching those barriers, those gaps in preparation, possibly, for contact?
Yeah, so I think you want a diversity of people, right? You want a diversity of thought. And actually one of the things in the novel that's not in this is it's actually a crew that's selected of international people. It's not just Ellie. So there's that focus on international collaboration, having that multinational perspective as well. If Steve wants to weigh in.
Yeah. So I have one more hat, so I'm going to put it on now. This is my philosopher's hat. So you know, you guys got to work with me on my hats. Come on, you know. All right. So aliens in movies are always portrayed as bad guys, right? I mean, there are very few movies with aliens as good guys, and aliens are always portrayed as smarter than us, which is kind of weird. And women in science fiction are almost always portrayed as not equal to men. So I think last year, and Zach, correct me if I'm wrong, I think last year we did Alien. You guys watched Alien.
2 years ago. 2 years.
2 years ago, okay. Yeah. And Alien was, I believe, the first movie. So this was 1979 when Alien came out. It was the first movie that had a woman who was not only like in the movie, but was the lead role and beat the alien and was a tough guy and all that. And
Tough
before
gal.
that, women in science fiction movies were, even if they were portrayed as scientists, there were 6 people in a lab, and they all had lab coats, and 5 of them were guys, and 1 was a woman, and the guys would all work on the experiment, and the woman, who was a scientist, would go get the coffee. I mean, it was, such a weird portrayal of women in that. And Alien really broke that mold, and I think since Alien, we've somewhat come back in it, that after Alien, women in science fiction roles never had a really great role until this movie, where clearly Jodie Foster was the star, right? She was the good guy, and she ended up doing the kind of trip in space and all that, even though they had this sort of catastrophe with her advisor, who basically took over her research. And then, of course, good versus evil. I thought it was great. He got killed, so that was good. So he got rid of the bad guy. And in the end, she was like the star of this. And so I think we're still wanting to have women in many, many science fiction roles as being scientists and being the prime character. But I think we're making progress, much more than we did from the 20s to the 60s.
Yeah.
But just to chime in here, what about like in actual? Sorry, where am I? There I am.
Hey.
In actual like NASA policy, how are you diversifying sort of roles for women and even people of color in NASA itself?
Sure. So in NASA itself, I mean, Tracy, you can answer for you. In NASA itself, I think we're actually doing a great job. I mean, there's the sort of political view where you say the words, but I think there's a reality view that a diverse workplace is one of the greatest workplaces you can have. And it's diversity in every aspect you can think of. I mean, I'm kind of an older guy, Tracy's kind of a younger woman there, and that's a great diversity. But there's also diversity in not only age, but there's diversity in experience, in race, in how you grew up, in what your education is. And I think NASA does a really great job in working with all these areas to get people in. I mean, I work with about 400 people that are sort of part of my division where I work. And I think that I could probably build a histogram of how many women, how many, non-white people, how many old guys, how many whatever. And it would be roughly equal across the board. And that, to me, is a fabulous workplace, because the ideas you generate from people's experiences, the ideas you generate from people's backgrounds, and the ideas you generate from people's ages and where they came from is really what makes a science project great.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think NASA does a really good job and really does try to do a good job with diversity. As a government agency, you have to publish those kind of diversity statistics. So in terms of the technical workforce, NASA is about, I think, 30% women now, which ideally we would like to be 50%. We're going to work to get there. But if you look at the private sector, it's much, much less than that for women in technical fields. And my supervisor is female. My project manager that I primarily support is female. I rarely find myself as the only female engineer in the room. So they're doing pretty well on that front, in my view.
So I encourage you all to come work for NASA. It's a great place to work.
It is. It's the best place to work in the federal government, as
Well,
voted by employees.
Yeah, that's kind of funny, right? Every year we get this sort of survey where they ask all the people in federal government, what's the best place to work? And NASA always wins. And while that's great, it's like, come on, what else is there?
All right,
Yeah.
let's get some more questions out here. Sorry.
Hey there. What are your feelings on the prospect of humanity becoming an interplanetary species?
Wow. Yeah, that's really great. This is probably a great time to bring up TRAPPIST-1. How many of you know about the TRAPPIST-1 planet system? Wow. Okay, a few hands. Okay, so one of the great things you would like to find in the universe is you would like to find another planet that you might believe is kind of like the Earth, and you'd like to find that planet pretty close by in space, right? We talked earlier about how space is big. And so TRAPPIST-1 was a system discovered about a year ago, and it's a star that's 40 light years away. 40 light years is a long way. If you travel at the speed of light, it cleverly takes you 40 years to get there. But 40 light years is such a neighborhood in space. I mean, it's like down the street, right? And so TRAPPIST-1 has 7 planets that we know about. They're all roughly the size of the Earth. 3 of them are in the habitable zone. So that's a possibility that 3 of them are like the Earth. And only being 40 light years away means that even if we could never travel there, we could pretty easily have communication with those planets. Right, it takes 40 years for a radio signal to get there. It takes 40 years for the radio signal to get back. All right, granted, that's 80 years. That's a long time. But once you do that, now you have a communication because messages are constantly going and messages are constantly coming back. Another system, Alpha Centauri, has a faint star called Proxima Centauri. That particular system is only 4 light years away. And there's believed to be a planet the mass of the Earth that orbits that star. So we're really working now on finding planets that are relatively nearby in space, planets that could be like the Earth. And that's where we start talking about your question of could we be an interplanetary species? And how we do it means we've got to develop very fast propulsion. We've got to develop much larger spaceships. And we've got to develop the ability to travel long distances in space.
Yeah, so not only do I think we can be an interplanetary species, I think that we have to be in order to ensure the survival of our species. And I know I share that belief with a lot of people in the space community. I do think that Mars colonization is certainly possible within my and your lifetimes if that's where we decide we want to invest. No bucks, no Buck Rogers. The first rule of space flight from the right stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. How many of you would like to spend 100 years in a spaceship if you could be in stasis and then wake up and you'd be on some other planet? All right, we have a few people in the back. Excellent. Another sign-up sheet in the lobby. Put your names on.
All right, I saw some back here, which is why. Okay, I'm gonna come to you.
Hi, just a quick question. We always are looking for planets like Earth. So, is there a reason why? Is it a scientific fact that all evolution will lead to beings like humans, or is there a chance of little green men? And a follow-up question is, what are your 2 favorite, both of you? What are your favorite science fiction films? So, yeah.
Tracy, you want to start on that?
Oh, okay. So it was the first part of I was looking for Earth-like planets versus other things. So if you look at the authorization bill that just passed Congress, there's a lot of funding in that for looking at a Europa mission that's been kind of talked about for a long time called Europa Clipper, which would be an orbiter, and then potentially someday a lander with a little submarine that would drill into the ice in Europa because it's hypothesized that you would find, extremophiles living there. If you've seen Europa Report, you might also find a Loch Ness Monster. Who knows? So that's something that's not Earth-like, but it's potentially believed to harbor life. And my favorite science fiction films, this is definitely one of them. 2001 is the other one. And I'm a huge Space Camp fan from 1986, just to go a little campy.
Yeah, I think you raise a good point that we are whatever we are as a human species, and we developed on the Earth. And clearly in our own solar system, we don't believe that the Earth is the only possibility for life. So this idea of a habitable zone, which started probably when Kepler was launched and Kepler started finding small planets, because the sort of holy grail when Kepler was launched was to find planets that are like the Earth, and that is like in the sense of they orbit a star like our sun, they orbit in the right distance like our Earth does. And I think astronomers have really moved away from that because we realize from our own solar system and from the possibilities of life in our own that the habitable zone doesn't mean so much anymore. Life can exist in all kinds of places, and maybe searching just for things like us is not really the only goal. So I think you're right that we would like to find something like Earth too, because we're very familiar and it's very emotional to us to find something like that. But life could be all sorts of things and all sorts of all sorts of planets and all sorts of planetary things. They could be cold, they could be hot. Life really has a way. There's this great, the great line in, I think it's Jurassic Park or something, right? Jeff Goldblum says something like, "Life has a way," when they claim they're going to stop the dinosaurs from mating and having other dinosaurs, right? And he basically says, yeah, I don't believe that. Like, life has a way, right? And we see that even on our Earth, right? There's life here that lives in incredibly extreme environments, things that humans could never survive. Wow, favorite science fiction films? Well, I really like Alien. I think it's great. I like the fact that there's a long woman there. I'm a kind of a real fan of the 50s B movies. But probably if I had to pick one, we all do this when we're, having parties with our friends on, what's your favorite, blah, blah, blah. And I'm not sure I could pick one, but if I did pick one, it would probably be The Day the Earth Stood Still. The original one, not the dumb one with Keanu Reeves. Zach, you're working, man.
I have a question about the golden record that was included on Voyager. So 40 years after its launch, what do you think its importance and significance is overall to NASA, to contacting other forms of life? And additionally, for contact, where do you think culture fits in as a mechanic, as a tool?
I see the golden record as a collective civilization attempt to reach out. And so there are a lot of people who think there's a lot of folly in that. We're like, don't broadcast yourselves. The aliens are going to come annihilate you. But I think it's our first kind of transmission out in that sense. And I love, that it includes all these elements of pop culture as well.
Yeah, so 40 years is a short time, right? And so in 40 years, we've barely made it out of our solar system, right? So the legacy of that record might be in 40 generations, not 40 years. But we all, I think, as Tracy just said, right? We worry about aliens being mean and evil and all that. And so think amongst yourselves. There you are in the audience there. So if the news came on, if we were like cut off, and all of a sudden the news broadcast comes on and says, an alien signal was found. I mean, would you all think that was great, or would you all think, holy shit, the aliens are coming to get us? And it's a mindset, right? And if you get a communication from an alien civilization, and we use the word alien, which has, I think, a negative connotation, we use that, and right away, I think we would all be fearful, right? Maybe many of you, I'm trying to kind of see the audience there. Many of you probably maybe don't remember, but have heard of the sort of War of the Worlds broadcast that was done by Orson Welles, right? And people freaked out. There were people committing suicide and people, going out in the streets and yelling and screaming. The aliens are attacking and all that. And so I think by our nature is we would worry that any communication would be bad. And I can imagine, much like in the movie, the military would decide to take over and we would all see it as a negative thing and not a positive thing.
More questions? Yeah.
Hi, thank you. Similarly, could you just speak to how you or your peers in NASA or people or the community sees Sagan's legacy and what we can learn from what he wrote and said that you think is more important now than ever, if anything?
So for me, I know that Sagan believed very much in the model of international collaboration for human space endeavors. So I think that is something that certainly we would need, right? If we're going to go to Mars, it can't just be the U.S. alone. We don't have that kind of money or effort to put toward it. And you see, even with things like Space Launch System, which is the rocket that's being developed at NASA Marshall, the service module for that is being built by European Space Agency. James Webb Space Telescope is launching on an Ariane rocket, which is from ESA, it's a European rocket as well. So I think that's pretty critical in terms of actually getting things done, because some of these projects are so so grand and requires so much engineering effort that it has to really be an international partnership. And space station also is a key example of that, right? If space station were U.S. alone, it probably never would have happened. It's Russia, it's a number of other, I think 19 partner countries as well that have experiments and modules.
And so Tracy's a bit younger than I am, and I was pretty fortunate to actually have worked on a project that Carl Sagan was involved in many, many years ago, and kind of near the end of his career and the beginning of my career. And I always kind of got the feeling from him that, you know, science was important, but the sort of philosophy of being a partner to the world was a really important thing as well. And you know, clearly in our current administration, we don't believe that way as a political view from Washington, D.C., at least for the administration. And besides the fact that we really need everybody to work together to financially afford this, I think that once again, as we talked about a little bit earlier with diversity, bringing the world together is really one of the great things that science has been a forefront in, where scientists tend to not care so much about political boundaries and care so much about political systems, they care about science. And I think Carl Sagan was a very big proponent of that and was probably slightly ahead of his time in terms of what he could envision in those days. And I would say that now more than ever, we need scientists to be one of the groups that try to bring the world together and try to make the United States not become an isolationist country, but become a country of the world.
Oh, all right. I'm gonna step in here. That
Hey,
seems
Zach.
like the Hey, good to see you. It seems like the absolute best way to just sort of wrap up this month of Science on Screen we've had. That's like hopeful in, you know, we love that. We want that to be the message. Any last words from you, Steve?
Live long and prosper.
All right. Yes, back at you. Tracy, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you
Steve,
for joining us.
thank you. And
Thanks
thank
for
you all.
talking.
Please carry this message of hope and science and wonderment out into the universe, and we'll see you next time. Thanks for being here.
So, take some NASA stuff in the lobby.
Yeah, take some NASA stuff. Put stickers on your car.